Hey there, all you After Effects students. We're live again in Todd's crazy After Effects class, and we're going to learn how to use particles tonight. Say hello, everybody. All right, so here we go. So we're gonna work on particles tonight inside of After Effects. So we've already opened up After Effects. We have already created a main composition for our particles, and we've brought in an image that we can use to work on our particles with. And the whole idea behind this particular image is we're going to make power emanate from Dallas's shoulders like Dragon Ball Z style. So we've also done a little bit of reference to see what we want to do with that, and it kind of looks like, I think we're kind of going for what, like this kind of a look? No? This one right here? This one right here, the blue power coming from the shoulders thing. That's what we're gonna go for. Okay, so that being said, we're gonna kind of try to make some blue, crazy looking power aura stuff that we can make come out from around Dallas's shoulders. All right, but first we need to actually learn about how particles work. So we're gonna go to our main composition, and in order to get particles to work, you need a layer solid. So we're gonna go to layer, we're gonna click on our timeline, layer, and we're gonna go new, solid. And we're gonna title this solid, particles. And I'm gonna make the particles black. Actually, let's make them blue because we're doing like blue power. Let's do a blue particle. Kind of like I'm gonna do kind of a lighter, medium blue color, and I'm gonna click OK.
Wait.
DeAndre? Okay, we're making a layer solid.
Yeah, layer solid.
Yep. So we're making a layer solid, we're titling it particles, and we're changing the color to blue. And then we're clicking OK, and we're gonna have a blue layer solid on our screen. Okay, and then the particle effect that we're working with is called CC Particle World. So we're gonna type in Particle World over here on our little effects and presets finder, and we're gonna use CC Particle World. And we're gonna drop that on our layer solid, and that gives us particles. And you can see if we start scrubbing our current time indicator, we have particles spilling out of a little particle generator in the middle. Everybody with me?
No.
I heard a no. Who said no? What part am I missing?
I'm so sorry. I don't know, I'm just like too behind in this class.
Sean, can you help, please? So we created a layer solid and a composition, and we're dumping the CC Particle World effect onto our layer solid. And if we scrub, this is what we get. So the first part of this lecture, we're just going to go through the particle system, and we're going to go through all the parameters. This particle system has tons and tons and tons of parameters. So some of the effects that are inside of After Effects are very simple, and some of them are very complex. And this one is one that's really complex. It's got a lot of bells and whistles to it. There's tons of options. There's tons of ways in which you can make your particles do different things. And it can be a little confusing, so if I get away from you, just please raise your hand and ask. Don't be afraid to ask questions. All right, so here we go. So let's just start. Everybody's got this. Let's look at the effect control panel. I'm going to bring that up to full screen so you guys can see it a little bit better. So in the effect control panel, well, maybe I won't bring it up full screen because then you can't see what's going on the screen. All right, so we got grids and guides first at the top. So grids and guides basically give you like all the different parts of the effect so that you can see all of the grids and guides. So grids and guides are like the little Z thing in the upper left-hand corner. It's the grid down on the bottom. It's the particle generator box or source, whatever you want to call it. That is part of all the grids and guides. So if you want to turn any of these specific things off, you can come in here into grids and guides, and you can shut off things like the motion path, the radius, all that stuff. And you can control some other things. Like if you have motion on your particles, it will actually show you the motion path of the particle over time. So you can set it to like denote that motion path over longer or shorter amounts of frames, etc., etc. The grid, you can turn the grid on and off. When you render particles, it will not actually show you all those things. So when you render the particles, what you will see is the particles rendered without any of the grids and guides on there. You can also, I think you can force it to show the grids and guides if you did, for whatever reason, want to render the particles with the grids and guides. I believe that is an option. So there's some options in here for the grid. And if you click on the grid and you click on Particle World, it will bring you back all of your grids and guides, just FYI. So grid position right now is the floor. If you change the grid to the producer, it will hide the grid, but you can see that the grid is now in the same area that the producer's in. If you grab the little gizmo in the upper left-hand corner, it will rotate the camera around the particles. If at any time you need to reset back to 0 to get your particles back to their original settings, you can go ahead and just click the reset button and it will set everything back to the original settings. Okay, grid subdivisions. You can tell it how many subdivisions you want on your grid. You can have more or less there. There's horizon line options. The axis box you can turn on and off. You can change the size of your grid. Sometimes that's helpful if you're trying to line the grid up with something in 3D space and you want it to look similar to, say, like a road or a box or a part of a wall or something like that, so you can fine-tune how the particles are working. That is a handy tool to use, that grid. All right, so that's grids and guides. And then we're going to move on to birth rate. So birth rate basically controls how many particles are getting birthed per second, right? This is kind of an arbitrary value. The higher the birth rate, the more particles are going to come out of your particle generator per second. And you can push that to insane numbers. The slider says 0 to 20, but you can make lots and lots of particles come out of your particle system very quickly. Also note that Particle World is a memory and processor hog. So the more copies and the more particles that you are generating, the more render time it's going to take to render out your files. I just hit reset and reset this back to 0. So birth rate controls how many particles are being born, at what time they're being born. If you wanted your particle system to say pulse, you could create keyframes where it goes from 0 to 10 and then back to 0 and then from 0 to 10 and back to 0, and it would pulse. Why don't we give that a shot? Let's make our Particle World pulse real quick. So let's go to 0 seconds and set a keyframe for birth rate. So I'm just clicking on the little stopwatch where it says birth rate, and that's going to put a keyframe on my particle layer. If I click on the particle layer and push U, it will show me the birth rate keyframe. Is everybody with me?
Wait, particle layer? Where is it?
So we're animating the birth rate. So click on the stopwatch on the birth rate,
Yeah, I already did.
and then click on the particle layer itself down in the timeline, and push U, and it will show you where that keyframe is. All right, so right now what we want to do is we want to set the particle birth rate to 0, right? We want no particles being born until we want them to be born. And so let's just make this pulse at the 1 second mark. So I'm going to go to the 23rd keyframe, so 23 frames in, and I'm going to set another keyframe using the little diamond to the left of the birth rate text fly out. Did everybody see how I did that? Okay, so you're pushing this little button right here, little keyframe button. That's just setting an in-between, right? So we want no particles being born from 0 to 23 frames, and then we're going to click over. I'm hitting Command right arrow, and I'm clicking over to the 1 second mark, and we're going to set the birth rate up to 10. And then I'm going to click Command right arrow 2 more times to move forward a few keyframes, and we're going to set the birth rate back to 0. Right, so if I play this back right now, this is what I get. Piff. I get a little pop of particles.
Wait, you went a few seconds ahead afterwards.
A few frames ahead. So this is kind of where my keyframes are right here. I've got a keyframe at 0 of 0 birth rate, and then I've got a keyframe at 23 frames at 0 birth rate. Then at 1 second, I increase the birth rate to 10. And I think I moved forward 3 frames, and I set the birth rate back to 0. And so now we're just getting a pulse of particles flying out at 1 second.
It's like a poof.
Yeah, it's just a little piff. It's like a firework. So we play that back. I'm gonna set my my play area or my work area to just around 2 seconds, and I'm gonna play this back, and we're just gonna see that little piff of particles playing over and over again.
Yeah, it does look like a firework.
Looks like a firework.
How do you change it from frames to seconds? Yeah. The time
You can, I believe you just command click on it. So hit command and then click on the time and it'll change it from frames to seconds. Okay, so was everybody able to make the birth rate animation happen? DeAndre.
Yeah, I did.
You got it? You guys got it?
Yeah, I got it.
How long did you?
Where it's like, it goes from 0, it has that quick 10-0, but it's like, it's still like raining when it's at 0.
I think it's a wait.
I'm going to pause this for just a minute. Okay, so we've got a piff of particles happening. And now we're going to move on to the other parameters. So the next thing we're going to look at is longevity. So over here, longevity. Longevity is how long the particles last after they're born, right? So you'll notice this comes out at 1 second, and then right at about 2 seconds, all of our particles are dead. So the particles are only living for 1 second. So if we wanted the particles to live longer, well, we increase the longevity. So if I make the longevity 2 seconds, you will notice that our particles last much longer on the screen. So if I play this back again, piff, my particles actually fall all the way off the screen before fully dying. Longevity controls how long the particles live. All right, so longevity, that is one of these parameters that is unfortunately not animatable. Longevity has a fixed number, so if you have specific particle systems that need to live longer than other ones, you're going to have duplicates of your particle systems to make certain settings last longer, to have certain particle settings last longer. So one of the things that you'll do a lot with particles inside of After Effects is you'll layer up. So generally the way that works is you'll set up a particle system that does what you kind of want it to do, then you'll duplicate it, change some of the parameters, maybe make them live longer, make the particles a little bit different, change the lighting on them, etc., and you'll continuously add layers of particles until you get something that looks really interesting. DeAndre. We'll get there. We're going to go through all the parameters first. You have to start at the ground before you can, fly. All right, so here we go. We're going to move through. Longevity is how long your particles last. Producer. The producer is this little red circle right here. So it is what is actually creating the particles. So you can change the producer's position. So you can have the producer move up, down, left, right, and in Z space, right? So that can be handy. Like, let's say you have a dragon that's blowing fire, right? And you want the particles to come out of its head as it's moving across the screen. Well, you probably need the producer to be where its mouth is on the screen, wherever that happens to be. So you are going to have to animate your producer every now and again. And then that whole thing that I told you where you can use that script to motion track your particles to like a hand or a wand or something like that, that's super helpful in terms of generating animation for your producer. So if we give this producer some motion, say we go back here to 0 seconds again, and then I click on the X position keyframe, I'm going to go down to the particle and I'm going to click on the particle layer one more time and I'm going to push U to show me the particle, to show me the parameters that I've animated, and I'm going to make my particle producer kind of move across the screen. So I'm taking that first keyframe and I'm going to set it where the 0 is at 23 frames, and then I'm going to have it kind of scoot across the frame real quickly. I'm just going to have it scoot to the right a little bit. So I added some motion to my producer, and this is what I get. I get a completely different animation. Surprises, surprise, surprise. Sean, did you have a question? So you can see that you can control the position of your producer just like you would anything else. And that position is separate from the layer. So you're not controlling the position of the particles with the actual layer position. You're controlling it with the producer position. That's really important to know. If you move the layer, all of the particles on the whole layer will move and it'll look all effed up. So you don't want to actually change the position of the layer. You want to change the position of the producer. Was everybody able to make their producer move across the screen with a little bit of animation?
Yep.
Can you help? All right. So we've also got radius, right? So let's look at what radius can do. So radius controls the size of the producer, right? And you've got radius X, Y, and Z. So your producer is taking up three-dimensional space, right? So if we increase the radius over time, we can change the look of our particles as well. So I'm going to kind of do some animation work from 23 frames to where it goes back to 0. And we're going to just change the size of this producer over time, and it's going to change how our particles look. So I'm going to use radius X and Y to kind of make my producer larger on 2 axes. So I'm clicking the stopwatch on radius X and the stopwatch on radius Y, and I'm at 23 frames when I do that. I'm going to zoom in on my my keyframes down here a little bit so we can see what we're looking at. I'm also going to click on my particle layer one more time, and I'm going to push U so I can see all of my animated parameters. So I have keyframes set at X and Y. I'm going to then increase the size of this producer over time. So I'm going to have it grow larger on both X and Y over time, and you will see that it completely changes the way that our producer works. I'm playing with the keyframes a little bit so that I can actually make this animate over time. So in this particular instance, we probably want to space these keyframes out a little bit so we can get an idea of what our producer is doing over time. I'm just playing around with my keyframe positioning a little bit to try to get it to do something interesting. So you can see that the producer starts out really small and then grows over time, and I'm kind of getting this like crazy explosion of particles coming out of the producer. You can also control this along the Z-axis, and you can get a lot of different looks with your particles just by controlling the producer itself. So I've done a little bit of animation here. I'm going to back up. I'm actually going to reset all this stuff. So I'm going to reset CC Particle World, and I'm going to reset my layer solid. Everything looks good, and I'm going to get rid of all my keyframes too. So I should just kind of be back to the normal spraying settings of the original CC Particle World. So let's everybody go back to 0 basically. So delete your keyframes, and we'll start moving through some additional looks here. All right, so in terms of what you can do with the producer, so like let's say you wanted to make something that look kind of like a waterfall, right? Well, you could probably just increase the scale of the producer across one axis, like the x-axis, and then your particles take on a totally different look. Now it looks like a waterfall of particles instead of a firework particles. If you add additional birth rate to it and maybe change the color, you would have something resembling water, especially if you started layering this up and creating some mist and droplets and all kinds of additional layers to this would really start to make it look pretty interesting. So I'm going to set this back to 0.025 so it goes back to its original settings. Or you can click the reset button. Is everybody still with me?
I kind of went too far back.
Nope, we're back. We're basically back to 0. We're just stepping through and looking at what all these different parameters do. All right, so let's move on to physics. So everybody stay with me. I know you guys are having fun going in and playing and manipulating stuff, but just stay with me. Let's walk through the parameters before we start playing around and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. All right, so here we go. Physics. So physics controls how the particles move, right? Makes sense. It's like physics in video games. You got gravity, you got a bunch of different parameters that are working on the particles themselves. In more advanced particle systems like Trapcode Particular, you can add things like wind and viscosity and like all these different physical parameters to your particle systems to really make them look like they're part of nature. Like if you were using Trapcode Particular to create like a snowstorm, you could actually have like multiple torrents of wind moving through your particles and making the particles move in really interesting ways. We don't have wind, unfortunately, inside of Particle World, but it exists in a lot of the other higher end particle systems. So let's just step through and look at the different animation types. So the animation types, and these can be animated, so you can step between the different animation types to create some interesting effects. So let's just step through those. So the first one, the default is explosive. Then we got directional axis, and directional axis shoots the particles off in a specific direction, and that direction can be controlled by this new gizmo that we've got on the screen up here at the top. If we start moving this new gizmo around, we can control where those particles are flying. So you can make them fly all over the place with the directional axis. I'm going to go ahead and reset this back to 0 again. I just click the reset up here in the upper left-hand corner, and we're going to just step through a few more of these. So we got directional axis, we got cone axis, which is kind of like a fountain almost, right? It shoots the particles up in the air, and then the gravity sucks them back down. And again, you still have this gizmo, which you can rotate and control to make your particles fly out in specific directions. I'm resetting again back to 0. Let's look at viscous. So viscous is supposed to be kind of like water. So it's kind of derivative of explosive, but the particles move a little bit differently. They kind of have some random ways in which they fly out of the producer. So viscous is good for things like water. Twirl. Twirl is pretty self-explanatory. It makes your particles twirl around in a crazy circle. Twirly. Twirly is kind of a different type of twirl. It changes the way that the particles are twirling. Vortex. Pretty straightforward. This one creates a vortex of particles. Great for creating things like tornadoes. One of the neato things that you can do with the vortex is you can actually like point it at the screen, and it creates this kind of like Millennium Falcon hyperspace looking thing. I'm going to reset again, get this back to 0, and we're going to look at fire. So fire creates a nice kind of like torchy, fiery, random motion effect on the particles. Jet sideways. Jet sideways creates kind of your classic like cone of fire look that you'd get, say, out of like a rocket motor or something like that. This is again controllable with, I believe this is controllable with angle and stuff like that too. Yeah, you can throw some additional parameters in here to change the way that this kind of looks and moves and shakes. Fractal Omni creates this kind of strange fractal producer effect, similar to like viscous and explosive, but it has a specific look to it.
It's like it's welding.
Yeah, it could look like it's welding. And then Fractal Uni creates kind of similar to the particle fountain that we saw when we looked at twirl or cone axis, I think it was. Yeah. So you've got a bunch of different producer types in there that you can play with to get different styles and looks of your particles. So let's start playing with some of the additional parameters in physics. So I'm going to set this back to explosive. So velocity. Velocity controls the speed at which the particles leave the producer, right? So if I set the velocity down really low, it can look like the particles are just pouring out of the producer rather than exploding out of the producer. So I set that to like 0.01, and as you increase the velocity, the particles leave the producer faster and faster. If you set them really high, it creates that kind of hyperspacey look again. I'm going to set that back to 1. Inherent velocity. Inherent velocity is a really cool little feature. So let's set up a little animation here so that we can see what inherent velocity actually does for our particle systems. So let's go. Let's just have our particles do a simple move from left to right again. Actually, we'll have a kind of zigzag across the screen. So let's set our particle system movement at 0. Let's go in and start playing with the position X and the position Y. So I'm going to set keyframes for both position X and position Y. And then I'm going to move my particle system kind of to the upper left-hand corner. And I'm going to kind of create a zigzag effect with my positions. So I'm going to kind of move every half a second or so. I'm going to have this particle change kind of position and orientation. So I'm going to 12 frames, and then I'm going to go to 1 second. I'm going to have it just kind of zigzag across the screen a few times over the course of a couple seconds. So I'm just setting up some simple keyframes. And the last one, I'm just going to have the particle system fly all the way off the screen. So this is kind of what I've got right now. Particles just flying all over the place. Does everybody have an animated particle system?
I do not. Are you just moving the,
Just changing the X and the Y position of the producer. And I'm keyframing that. Does anybody need help? Okay, so we played around, we set up some animation, we have our particle system moving left to right, and we've started playing with inherent velocity, which makes the particle system inherit the velocity of the producer. So you can see it changes the way that the particles move pretty drastically. There's with the inherent velocity at 100. Here it is at 0. Completely changes the way in which the particles move. We've also played around with the gravity a little bit. Its standard setting is 0.5. You can see that the gravity pulls the particles down. If we set that to 0, there's no gravity acting on the particles and they fly off in random directions. Resistance. Resistance is kind of interesting. So resistance adds an external force to the producer. So if we push the resistance up, you'll notice that it vastly changes the way the particles move. Now there's a force acting in on the particles towards the producer. So now it changes, it basically limits the amount that the particles can move from the producer. The higher that setting is, the more resistance your particles are going to encounter as they move through space. You can kind of like vary your velocity and your resistance to create some kind of interesting effects using resistance. Extra and extra angle only really apply to the particle settings that are not explosive. So things like direction axis uses the extra and extra angle, and so does cone axis. So you can change extra and extra angle to get some interesting looks out of some of the different animation settings inside of the particle parameters. Okay, is everybody still with me? All right, let's go over a couple more things. So let's go ahead and reset. So I want you guys to reset back to 0. So go ahead and delete all of your keyframes. So make sure so you can find all your keyframes if you click on your particle layer and push U, it will show you all of your keyframes. Just delete all the keyframes and then let's reset Particle World back to its stock settings so that we can play with a few more of these parameters. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at the floor. So the floor does some really cool stuff. So if you open up that floor caret, it gives you floor position, which is where the floor is in relation to the producer. So you can set the floor above, below. You can kind of make it wherever you want in relation to the producer. You can change the particle's visibility in relation to the floor. So let's say you want your particles to be cut off by an invisible force. Well, that could be the floor, and if you turn on, say, only particles above the floor will be visible, and you change the floor position, it drastically changes the effect on your particles. You can also create very interesting rendered animations with the floor. So let's say our particles are reflected on the floor. You can create reflections with additional settings of your particle system. So like let's say we wanted to have a particle system above some ice, right? And we wanted to create a reflection for that ice. All right, well let's do that. So I'm going to take my particle system and I'm going to call my particle system this one above. Right? And then I'm going to create a reflection. I'm going to duplicate that particle system. And then we're going to go into physics, floor, and we're going to say render animation, reflected on floor, and it's going to give us a direct reflection of the particle system we just made. Then if we did something like, say, added a blur to it, let's add a directional blur to the reflected particles. I'm going to change this layer to call this the reflection. So if we add a little bit of a directional blur to this, we can see how we might be able to make kind of a reflection looking deal with our particle floor. So now it almost looks like there's a mirror surface there, which is kind of interesting. Let's play with this a little further. Go ahead, Riley.
How do you clone a layer again?
Command D for duplicate. So now we have two particle systems. We have one that's a reflection, and we have one that is the producer above our reflected ground, right? Let's play with the floor action a little bit on the above setting, and let's set that render animation to floor action ice. And then what's going to happen is these particles are going to hit the ice and spread out across the surface. So now you're starting to get an idea of all the crazy complexity and things that you can kind of start to create with the particle systems. And you can, I think you can also set, yeah, you could have these things bounce too. Like if you clicked bounce on them, they can bounce along the floor. If you went onto the reflection and you added bounce and onto the reflection, I believe, let's see, I'm going to solo that layer. Okay, it's not really doing anything. I'm going to say all. Now we have a proper reflection of the particles bouncing on our icy surface being blurred. All right. So lots of cool things that you can do with the floor. You can also, I'm going to just go ahead and solo the particles above layer because I'm just going to work on that one. You can control how bouncy your floor is. So if you really wanted your particles to really take off the floor and bounce a lot, you can increase the bounciness. You can increase the randomness of the bounciness, and you can animate all these parameters as well. So these parameters could change over time. Let's say your producer is getting closer to the floor and you wanted your particles to bounce off harder. Well, you could increase the bounciness over time as the producer gets closer to the floor. You can change the spread of the bounce as well. So how these particles kind of are affected by the floor, you can manipulate all of these different parameters to create interesting looks with your particles. And then if you were going to do this with a reflection, what you'd probably want to do is you'd want to duplicate this system one more time and then set up that floor so that it's properly reflecting your particle system. And then you could go ahead and you could add that blur back in and make it look like a reflection. All right. Okay, so let's take a break for 10 minutes. Come on back and we'll continue moving through the parameters, and then we'll start learning how to actually turn this into what we want to turn it into for our Dragon Ball Z effect. You want to flip the lights back on for me? Striking!
So red, eh?
Yeah. We got to fill in the rest of the...
Yes. Your cinema package you were selecting, you don't need to select that.
Yeah, I unselected it.
All right, cool.
I also reflected that in the price now.
Okay, cool. Because there is a lot of very unnecessary stuff in there that you can just switch out with some other stuff.
Yeah.
Like the red bricks aren't even worth the money.
Yeah.
A, you can't take those things on a plane.
Right.
And
What?
B,
You can't? Why not?
because they're over 100 million watt hours.
Really?
Yep. Anything over 100 you can't take on a plane. Anything under that you can take as many as you want.
That's crazy.
Which is why MJ doesn't have like these crazy big batteries, because he has to take those on a plane.
Right.
He can't.
Right.
Plus, they also don't have PTAP, so then you would only be able to run either your wireless video or your wireless FOLFO, because you couldn't run both because you would need an external.
Okay.
So
See, these are all things I don't know
this
because
is
I'm not
this
an
is why,
AC.
and it was really hard to tell you this stuff over text message. So I was
Yeah.
like, oh,
well,
you
you can always call me.
Yeah, we
Yeah,
were
well,
all, me
yeah,
and
when
Thomas
you-
were on Skype just going through lists of stuff for her.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
let's finish out that list and get it
Yeah.
off to Hamid like
Yeah.
next week, and
Yep.
he
The only
can
thing I'm
figure
so
out
I was
how he's gonna pay
texting.
for it.
I was texting MJ and just being like, "Hey, batteries. Your suggestion. I mean, I know some ones that he likes, but I just more what
yeah,
would
we
you
probably want like 3 to 5 of them.
At
least
least 6. Probably.
Yeah, 3, 5, 6. I mean, the ones under 100 watt hours are like half the price of like the red ones.
Okay.
So we could get, and it was.
Well,
pricing
and I
out-
figured like we'd use that as kind of a measure
Yeah,
of
exactly.
like how much this is going to cost, and then we
Exactly.
could go in and we could replace things that we don't
Yeah,
need,
like
and we could
like
fine tune
the Red's PL mount isn't that good. Like
Okay.
the one on MJ's camera isn't even the red one. It's by Wooden Camera.
Okay.
Which is a lot cheaper. The handles, I mean, you could use just about anyone's. Wooden
Okay.
Camera is what MJ was using last
Oh, I
time.
didn't like that one.
Yeah,
It's
it
got
was
a really,
really
jagged,
awkward.
jagged
Yes, that one's an
feel
awkward
to it.
one.
You want
There's-
something that's like got a nice
I've
soft
got-
feel to it.
Yeah, there's a
so
couple
that
different options.
There's
that you can
small
still do.
rig one.
doesn't
Small rig
wreck
has
your
some.
hand when
Yep,
you're trying
small
to
rig
shoot
has
it.
some. I mean, you can go with a red handle. Like, there's nothing wrong with that.
It's just 150.
Well, I mean, if it were me operating, I'd actually want a shoulder mount for it.
That's
Oh,
fair.
yeah,
I
you
know, I
can-
know Joseph doesn't shoot with a shoulder mount, but I would
Yeah.
totally.
Well, no,
want a
but the
shoulder-
handle's just more
shoulder
good for
mount.
carrying things around.
Right. I mean, you could still go from shoulder to handle
Very easily, yes.
and manipulate it, but like for stuff where I'm shooting,
Oh,
I
yeah.
want to be able to like put
Oh,
it
yeah.
on my
No, I get
shoulder
you.
and move.
I get you.
Joseph likes this.
I know, and I don't.
Well,
like
you also
the
have to realize
screen's too close to my face.
You also have to
and-
realize, Todd, that
He's
Joseph, like chest level is everyone else's shoulder.
I know.
So he
So like
can't.
that is his that he is doing a shoulder rig essentially.
I know. Well, the other thing that was really tough for me is like having that 7-inch screen this far away from my face. Like I
Oh,
can't
that-
fucking see what
I
I'm
still
looking
laughed
at.
so hard when you were like, "It's so dark, you can't even see anything." I'm like, "Todd, you're at f8 right now." Oh, open that up.
Duh.
And granted, that was partially my fault because when I changed the lens, I generally checked to make sure it's at where Joseph generally likes it. And I
Right.
didn't do that because I was just
Right.
like, "Oh."
He's
And I'm
on the
listening to
field.
us
And
like-
I was moving so fast, I wasn't even thinking about.
Yeah.
Oh, aperture settings. Duh.
Yeah. Well, because normally I set that for Joe because he just tells me like this is where I like to keep it. All right, cool.
Right.
But yeah. And then right now I'm looking at wireless videos because I was not impressed with Paralinks, which was really disappointing. I really was looking forward to see what Paralinks did, and it disappointed really quickly.
Okay.
Our
'Cause
best
that
bet
was
is
a pain in the. On
our
the-
best bet is Teradek Bolt 500, which is kind of a pricier one, but it gives
Let's
you
just put it in
Yeah,
there.
it gives you 500 feet line of sight
Yes.
and 100 without line of sight.
Yes. Yeah, the Paralinks was like 30 feet and done, dude.
Yeah, it was 300 feet line of sight, but I don't know what it was without line of sight.
Did you get a
It,
kick?
it really depended. Like
Yes.
some days it was good, some days
Yep.
it was terrible.
Yep.
Did you get a kick out of me chasing MJ, chasing Joseph around the gym?
I haven't seen that footage yet.
No,
No,
you
no.
know when we were doing the pep rally stuff.
It was
Because
just a train behind Joseph.
because
I
Oh,
gave up
yeah.
trying to be
because he
involved
had
in
to
it.
pull focus. I had to make sure MJ didn't die. So I was like, and then Joseph decides to do a full 360 shot around the
Yeah. He's crazy like that.
Yeah.
I did love MJ's like fast. Like
Oh, yeah, how he
mounted.
attached-
He
mounted
mounted
it.
He's
the
like, is there
follow-
Velcro? I'm like,
Yeah,
here.
he was literally just like, he was like, Mark, we'll see how this goes. I hope I don't break your unit. I was like, it's still insured, buddy.
Yeah, we're in good shape.
I was like, it's under warranty. We're good.
Good shape.
But yeah, so yeah, I was going through like that list. Like I was literally going through Red's accessories, just like going in the shop system instead of the build to camera system.
Yeah.
And just kind of finding exactly what we need and what we could get somewhere else.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah,
and
I
I'm
figured
trying to find a way to
we'd have more work to do, but I knew that if we like
Got a
just
base, yeah.
did a red package, we'd have a pretty good idea
Yeah.
of what it's going to cost
Yeah,
us,
there's
and
just
then we
like
can
a
go in
ton
and
of stuff.
figure.
Like the production kit on that is like their newest thing, and I'm like, that's really not necessary. It like adds like XLR ports. I'm like, but anytime you record audio internally to the Red is just terrible.
We're not gonna
Like
do
we
that
used it. We
anyway.
used it.
Why would that be? I mean, if you had decent XLR ports, you should be able to get
That's-
good
Well,
audio in.
it's also their
camera.
newest thing, like so I don't fully trust it. Like that literally just came out.
Hmm.
Um,
I mean, it's not that we would do that for movie
Exactly.
stuff, but it would be helpful if we were shooting freaking interviews to be able to run audio into the camera.
Oh, that.
I mean, you can still run it. You just gotta sync.
why are we
it.
doing audios on red? Oh.
But
Well, because if you're shooting an interview, you don't want to have to go sync all that shit after
No,
the fact.
I mean, why are we shooting interviews?
Do you need
with
help?
because it's good.
No, I-
Questions?
I needed to talk to you.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. Here, we'll get out of your way.
it? Yo,
Or she's going south. You need to go elsewhere? You want to do this here?
Okay. Yeah. Sure. Cool. I'm gonna sit in his chair.
pull up that. I pull up the shoulder like thingy I sent you.
Oh, he picked one out. That's good.
No, I know, but this one has like the top handle and all that stuff.
Oh, I'd rather go with a different top handle than what comes with the shoulder rig itself.
No, just look.
I don't have it saved on here, Sean.
It's in Skype.
Skype.
Never drive anything in the Dragon Ball series.
There was like a whole episode about.
If Thomas calls me while this is happening, he's already sent Potato out. Oh, that was on the 21st. Never mind.
It was in
It
our.
would have been. Yeah, no, I realized that as I'm about to click.
Yeah, it's that
Have
one.
a picture of
Yeah.
Goku like driving a motorcycle or a car, but in the series he's never driven those things.
Yeah, I've seen those ones.
I was just because it had the bottom plate like MJ's.
Yeah.
Or he just rides on flying Nimbus.
Or you just fly.
Yeah, it's an option. I'm not a big fan of that top handle. I don't like it facing the other direction.
But can you?
You can't. No.
No, I meant just go click on their other stuff. Get one without that top handle.
Yeah, I'm just looking at different top handles to find one that I feel like is going to be comfortable.
I was more for the bottom plate.
Yeah.
Because the bottom plate for the one in camera is $1,000, and
Yeah.
He wasn't driving it, it was on
I remember I was like, it was
I know. I'm just looking at
whatever, and I was like, oh, no, I don't want to be
two rigs.
And then I just,
They just have one top handle for them.
Oh yeah, the audio.
I mean, it's NATO rail, so I mean, technically you can move it to the front, but it doesn't look like. But then you're blocking that port.
but there's that base plate.
Yeah, there is the base plate, but it's still. It can only really go on.
No, I was talking about the other one.
So,
I was
yeah,
talking about
there's
that.
this base plate.
One of those you have to make like a soundscape, like you know, like an atmosphere.
I remember that one.
Yeah, and then the other one is correcting mistakes in an audio file, and that one I feel is a little harder.
Series.
Go to Tilton.
Adding
I've gotten
something
Tilta. I just don't want to put that much
5 sounds.
money into them right now. They're already taking some of our money with the follow focus. I mean, we don't really need to buy the follow focus right now because I have one
Yeah.
that is full. That has it's at the need. If it's needed, it's completely at everyone's disposal for it. Find shot.
Yeah, I was thinking I'm gonna do like a cave, and then I'd have.
They don't have a lot of good handles though. Like they have the side
They
handle.
had that one, and
They have the. This is a newer top handle too. I haven't
that's the
seen
one.
this one.
That's one MJ has.
Was
Nope.
there like a police radio in it?
He doesn't have one like that.
So, okay, I think I
He has one with the button in it, and that one has a button.
That was the wooden camera one. He owned the wooden camera handle.
There's that.
And then there's this one.
I like Tiltas, even though it gave it.
Yeah, the only problem with the tilt is
Do they have another one that's not with
I don't
like?
think so.
I'll give you the project files for those so that you can remove the muffle effects in your Mac. It's fine though, 'cause like, you know, it's like
Potato flies out around.
Yeah, you can only buy their kit.
That's what I'm saying.
They don't have like just handles.
Okay.
Let's see. Well, you'd have to buy. Then you have to buy the top mount and all that other stuff.
Well, I wonder if they have like.
It's yeah. They have the handles, but these have to go onto a certain plate. And if you buy the plate, then you have to buy the battery extension.
I don't know what I want to do for my credit.
You don't need to buy these ports because I think you can still use the straight up red ones because that's what we were using in summertime as well.
I remember. No, it wasn't you, but I was. No, I think you did see me. I did like that Dylan green screen dance video.
Oh, yeah,
Use
yeah,
another
yeah, yeah.
page.
Since we have to use our own stuff, I have that video anyways. It's green screen, right? So I could just add particles to the back of that.
But yeah, it's all just battery
Just search
extenders.
red camera handles.
We had Dylan just sing the One Piece opening.
Because yeah, I mean the tilt one. This one is honestly the best handle we've used.
Yeah, I like it because you have that back section.
It just comes down to
Like, I added some like.
One, wasn't that like $3,000 for that pack?
I believe it's like 2 something or 3 total.
But then like towards the end of the song, it just custom going One Piece, just like out of context.
Yeah, it's like $3,000 to get. Well, to get certain packages for it. You can get this one, which I think, which is just the base. Most base model is 1500, which is really all we would need. You could just go V mount, and you don't need to attach all this extra stuff. We didn't attach any of it. But then you would just be using just red ports that are already on the camera and whatnot. You have full access to
That's
this.
not with the expander.
The expander.
Yeah, because on summertime, did we have the expander?
Moving the expander for ports.
Yeah.
We had one on top. We didn't have one on the back.
But you know what I'm talking about, with the HDMI and the...
Yeah, that was just the standard. What was already in the red that you can. It's something that you can buy for the red, and this one comes also with a bottom plate as well, which we did use as well. So I mean that's an option. That gives us a good top handle. The only thing is just was that guy's treatment of his Tilta stuff bad, or was it Tilta itself?
Yeah.
But we'd also have it under warranty as well. And if we bought another handle just in case,
Well, I'm gonna try to work on mine.
because everything can be used,
You
most of it
have
can be used
your-
independently. Yeah, well, just a handle that's actually more meant for it.
I'd probably throw the $150 handle from Red in there.
Probably, yeah. Just something that if we needed to, we'd have it. But
Yeah.
yeah, just getting this handle to pretty much just give us a base handle.
Oh yeah.
Probably would need this.
The thing is, I want to say,
Correction.
What is that?
That is your, you put that on top, and that is your port, so you can,
Monitor.
yep, the monitor.
And those Limo,
Original.
Yeah.
yeah, I found out those are fragile.
What'd you do?
Oh no, I didn't break it, but I'm just never twist.
Oh yeah, no, you don't want to twist.
No,
You break those things and you're fucked.
No, I know. No,
You just send the entire whatever.
he just went over with me to be like, don't twist those.
Yeah, because if you twist it, you need to buy a new. You would need to buy a new one of these, which is $200, which isn't massively horrible when you consider red. But
The cable, $200.
yeah, the cable, you'd have to buy a new cable, which is $240 from Red directly.
Yeah.
So that's something we'll have to go over with Todd. I know he's done a little bit, but
Yeah,
these cameras be very selective. Who you?
yeah. I mean, if he wants a side handle, he can go with this as well instead of getting the side winder, the side kick. I mean, this is kind of a nice thing to have, but I don't know how much. It's a nice thing to have, but also not a nice thing to have. I know how much you like shoulder rigs, but the question of how much to use the shoulder rig is.
I went to Barnes and
And how much is he actually going to be?
I went there and there's just so much.
Oh yeah, I totally did.
Oh, great.
Oh, great! We've been crap talking the whole.
Okay, now we're starting again. You got to learn some things about cameras and stuff that we were gonna get. I'm pretty sure. All right, so let's keep on cruising through parameters. All right, so we've been playing around a little bit with our particle system. We were working with the floor and kind of looking at all the cool stuff that you can do with the floor. We created a reflection using a second duplicate of that particle system with a blur on it. Now we're just going to kind of move through the additional parameters here. So let's get our particle system back to its original settings. So I'm just going to reset everything. And I'm going to make sure I have no keyframes, which I don't. I push U to see all the different keyframes. And now we just have our standard setup here. And we're going to go through and we're going to continue looking at some of these additional settings. So, direction axis. The direction axis is used on particles with the animation types like cone axis and directional axis. So if you have cone or directional axis, you should be able to come in here on the directional axis and change the way that these particles are being fired.
Do you mind if I turn the lights off there?
Not at all, go for it.
Todd,
Yes.
they're grayed out.
For which setting?
Direction access.
That's interesting.
Are they on cone axis or directional axis?
They should be available on both of those.
Is this on rotate?
No, we're changing the animation type to direction axis. So we're looking at the direction axis settings, right? So the easiest way to really play with the directional axis is with the gizmos. So if we stop this, you can see the gizmos, and the directional axis can be controlled with this gizmo right here. And the direction axis really only shoots out like horizontally. The cone axis is a lot more tweakable. You can actually have it fire in pretty much any direction. So you can have this thing spray in any direction.
I don't get that little thing. When
You got to click on the effect in order to see all the gizmos. So go to the effect controls and click on particle world. Like if I click off particle world, you'll notice that I have no gizmos, right?
I still don't have it. Yeah.
Really? You should. Are you in the composition setting? If you're on the layer itself, you will probably not see them. Okay, you will see them. Let me look at your screen here. So let's see what you have. Oh, you don't have the right. You are on cone axis. Okay, so go up to grid and guides. Put that and then. Reset it once more. Go back down. Set that to cone axis. That's weird. Oh wait. Composition. There you go. Okay. So you can control the direction of the cone axis and the directional axis, and there's a couple other animation types that I think use this, like jet sideways. Oh no, not jet sideways. Let's see. I have to remember. Yeah, Fractal Uni uses this as well, so you can use this directional axis to spray the particles in specific directions. This is really handy for things like fire or anything where you want it to be projecting the particles in a specific direction, obviously. Gravity vector. So gravity vector is kind of interesting. This changes the way that gravity works on your particles. So I'm going to set this back again. I'm just going to reset everything back to 0. And the gravity vector changes the way that gravity pulls on your particles. So if you set your gravity vector to 1 on the x-axis, it will pull your particles sideways rather than down. If you set it to, say, -1, it will pull it to the left. So you can control the direction in which gravity is pulling by controlling the gravity vector. I'm going to set those back to 0 and set gravity on the y-axis to 1. And that should set us back to our original settings. All right, so that is all the physics parameters. Let's start going through the particle parameters. This is where it gets really fun. Okay, so you have a ton of different particle types too. So just like with the animation types, we have particle types. So we can have it spew stars. We can have it spew shaded spheres. We can have it spew faded spheres, darkened and shaded spheres or faded spheres, bubbles, which are terrible, by the way. I hate the bubble preset. Motion polygons, these just create little triangles that fire out of the producer. Motion squares, so little squares. Like if you wanted to, say, make pieces of paper fly around or whatever, motion square is a good one to use for that. Tripoly is polygons that are little triangles, but they fire off in random rotations. Quad poly is a square that fires off in random rotations. You can see that the particles kind of change direction when they come out of the producer. Yep, you can add your own. Textured tripoly. So when you get to textured tripoly, you're going to see it go black. You're going to see nothing on the screen. That's because the textured versions need a texture layer to work. And when we did the preview last week, we brought in a little skull, and we had that act as a texture. I'm going to skip over that for right now, and we're just going to kind of continue moving through these, but we'll come back to how you can create particles of specific textures if that's something that you want to do. So textured tripoly and quad poly both work off of a textured layer. Tetrahedron creates these little 3D pyramids that fly off of the producer. Cubes obviously spews little cubes. Cubes can work really well for things like smoke. Like if you add like a Gaussian blur to your particles and then blur the crap out of it, you start to get some kind of like 3D-ish looking smoky things, and you can actually control the lighting on the cubes too. So when you start playing with color and light, you can create some really interesting effects using some of the 3D particle types. there's all kinds of ways to make smoke. We'll get there. All right, so lens convex. Lens convex creates these little circles, and they utilize the original color of the layer solid that you put the particle effect on. So when we chose a color blue, the reason that we're able to see the lens convex showing up the way that it does is because it's working off of the layer solid color. If you made your layer solid black, you probably will not be seeing any particles right now. So try changing the layer solid color to an actual color, and then you will be able to see lens convex. Same with lens concave. Lens fade is just a faded version of the lens. Darkened fade, again, is just a tighter fade. Lens bubble. I'm not a big fan. Like, if you're gonna make bubbles with the particle system, just use a texture because it looks way better. Textured square, again, is one that you need a textured for. Same with disc and same with faded disc. You need textures for all those to work properly.
Are you gonna show us how we can get
Yep, we will get there. Okay, so those are your different particle types. Let's select something where we can play with all these different types. All right, so let's select a quad polygon particle type. So that creates the little boxes that fly off in random directions and angles. So you can control a lot of the parameters around this specific particle type by using things like rotational speed. So if you crank the rotational speed up, these things are going to rotate a lot faster when they come off of the producer. If we say slow down the velocity a little bit in the physics setting, we'll be able to see these kind of rotate and change a little bit better. We could also lower the gravity to say half as much or a quarter as much. And now you can really see that the textured polygons are rotating much more quickly. If we crank that speed up even higher, you can see that they begin to rotate faster and faster and faster, or we can slow them way down to a crawl and have them rotate slowly. Initial rotation. So you can set this initial rotation to different settings, and it will change the way that these boxes are created from the producer and what rotation they're set in initially. Rotation axis right now is set to any axis. You can set this to specific axes to create different effects. So I set this rotational axis to only work on the x-axis or the y-axis, and it creates a different look for this particular particle system. Set it back to any axis and they rotate in 3D. Birth size and death size. These are pretty cool. So let's set the birth size to 0 and set the death size to say 1. So now what's going to happen is the particles are born tiny and then grow to very large over time. I'm just going to fine tune this a little bit so we can see the effect a little better. Increase the velocity a little bit more. And now you can see that they start small and grow up over time and then die. So birth and death size, if we flip those on their heads, say set it to 0.5 and then have it end at 0, they obviously will start at full scale and then they will scale down as they grow older and die. Size variation, this is kind of fun. You can have the producer produce different scales of particles at birth, basically. So the larger this percentage, the more variation in scale. So if I set it to 100%, the scales at birth are going to be very drastically different from particle to particle. Max opacity. You can tell it how opaque you want its particles to be. If you want them to be 100% opaque, you can set that to 100%. If you want them to be, say, 25% opaque, you can set them to 25%. And depending on what type of blending modes you're using, you can get different effects using the opacity settings. All right, is everybody still with me? You have a question, DeAndre?
Switch now in every direction.
What now?
The way that the particle is going in every direction.
Uh-huh.
How did you do this?
I'm just using the explosive particle type.
No, I think he means
Or explosive animation type.
where there's no gravity.
Yeah.
Oh, where there's no gravity, just shut the gravity off or turn the gravity on. So no gravity,
Gravity's like the third thing under the law.
gravity.
Oh, if you said
In
negative
physics.
gravity, you can make it go up.
Yeah, you can make it go up, you can make it go down, left, right, wherever you want. All right, so let's keep moving through these different particle settings. So opacity map. Opacity map is kind of cool, right? Right now we've got this kind of curve happening, right? Where the particles are born at 0 opacity, they come up to 75% opacity, and then they die at 0 opacity. And you can create custom maps for your opacity over time, right? So you can create particles that, you know, are born fully opaque and then get more transparent, and then there's a whole bunch of different options for this as well. I think if you can create particles that have, you know, varying opacities over time by just drawing in your opacity map. So now my particles are flashing rapidly over their lifespan. If I increase the lifespan, like if I change the longevity to say 5 seconds, you'll see these things flash much more slowly, because that birth to death map basically happens over the longevity of the entire particle. So the shorter the life, the faster that animation is going to take place. The longer the life, the slower that animation is going to take place. I could have sworn they had, like, maybe they changed this.
It almost looks like the camp competition from the 1990s.
You know, so you can change that animation, play with it, and it'll do different stuff. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to reset this again back to 0. So we got our original particle system set up. And then let's go in and change the particle type back to quad poly. And we'll start playing around with some additional changes. All right, so this, how do I reset? I could have sworn I could reset this thing.
Yeah, it's not resetting it when you click reset.
There, I mean, I swear there was additional options for this back in the day.
I know for sure in Adobe there's like a button right next to each one. You can click and it resets just
Yeah.
the value.
So if you want to get it back to like close to 1, you can just do kind of like this. That'll get you pretty close to the original settings. Otherwise, you can just grab a new version of Particle World and dump it on there, and it will fix it for you.
Or just Command Z.
Or you could Command Z. All right, so we're working with quad polys, and we're going through and working with all these different things. So you got different opacity maps that you can play with. Color maps. So color map controls the color of the particles from birth to death, right? So if you wanted these particles to, say, start out blue, like in our Dragon Ball Z thing, and then end white, you can change the birth to death color. You can also change the color map to different settings. So if you wanted it to go where is it? Birth to death. I wanted to go death to birth, but whatever. Origin to death basically means it uses the original color of the layer solid, and then uses the death color. Birth to origin means that it's going to use the birth color and then the origin color of the layer that you selected for particles. Origin constant means it's just going to be the color of the origin over time, even though it still looks like it's changing color over time. And then there's custom, and you can do all kinds of different custom stuff too. So if you go into the custom map, you have 5 different colors you can work with. So that's really handy for creating things like fire, where you want it to start out maybe white or yellow and then slowly transition to like a dark gray or smoky color. So there's all kinds of stuff you can do with the different custom colors. I'm going to set this back to birth to death. And then volume shade. So volume shade is kind of interesting. So quad poly it doesn't work for, but if you set this to cube, we can play around a little bit with the volume shade. So if you turn on the volume shade, you can see that it drastically changes the appearance of your particle system. And there's some different options for you in terms of blending modes for volume shading and color mapping. Okay, is everybody with me? That's pretty much all the particle parameters. We'll come back to the textured thing later. All right, so extras. Let's look at extras. So extras, camera effect. So the camera effect basically allows you to rotate the camera around your particles and look at your particles from different views, right? So if you wanted to say, look at these from the bottom and have the particles fall towards your face, you could change the rotation of the camera. When you start working with actual cameras in 3D space, which we're going to do next week, you can actually use cameras effectively with particles, and the camera will basically take over the camera that's in the particle system, and it will become the camera for the particle system. So if you have a shot where you, say, tracked the camera and you want your particles to interact in video, it will rotate around the particles properly when you animate the camera.
I have no idea what you just said.
That's okay. We'll get there. You can change the distance of the camera from the particles here. So if you want to get further away or closer to your particles, you can control the distance from there. So you can make your particle systems really small or large. You can use the effect camera for those things. Field of view is basically how wide or tight your camera's lens is. So if I zoom this in, or actually the larger the number, the wider the shot, the smaller the number, the closer the shot. So that's basically like a zoom lens built into the particle world. I'm going to set that back to the 45 where it was before, and I'm going to change my distance back to 1 where it was before, and we've got basically our stock look again. Depth Q. This one is kind of interesting. Okay, so depth Q basically allows you to give your particles a depth, right? So like, let's go up to the producer and change the Z radius and really increase the Z radius. Right, so now our particles are being created over a larger Z depth, right? So then if we go in and we start playing around with the depth Q, like if we turn fade on, you'll see that the particles only go back so far in Z space, and you can change the distance to reveal more particles over a longer space. If you change that to fog, it will change the color of the particles that fall off further in distance, right? Which is an effect we see in nature all the time. Things that are really far away kind of take on a more gray tone because there's more atmosphere between your eye and the thing way off in the distance. It's the same effect here in CC particle world. So if you were using particle world and wanted to give your particles and a feeling of depth over a vast distance, you can use those depth cues to help you do that. All right, I'm setting that back to none. Light direction. So light direction only works on particles that have a 3D look to them. I think like tetrahedron and cube are the ones that work the best for the light direction. So you can change the light direction. You'll see that when I change the light direction, the lighting on the cubes changes. So you can kind of inform your particles in terms of the source of lights in your shots and things like that. I'm going to go ahead and Control Z those and kind of get them back to neutral.
So you're essentially changing where the source of light is.
Correct. Higher end particle producers like Trapcode Particular will actually use After Effects lights for lighting within the particle system. So you can basically mimic the lighting or mimic the direction of lighting from a shot inside of Trapcode Particular, and all the particles will work off of the virtual lights inside of After Effects, which is pretty cool. It also creates shadows and things like that too on particle systems that are in Trapcode Particular or higher end particle system generators. Hold particle release. So hold particle release basically means that the particles will be generated. I'm going to reset this real quick so we can get a better idea of what this is actually looking like. So I'm going to reset this, and then I'm going to change my particle type back to cube. And hold particle release means that the particles will be generated at the producer, and then after a certain percentage of time of the life of the particle, they will be released, right? So if I set this to say 20% or 25%, let's make it easy, so 1/4. So this is kind of what we get, right? The particles are produced, and then after 25% of their life has expanded or expelled, whatever you want to call it, it will release the particles and they will act naturally. You can kind of get some interesting effects with this when you change like the birth and death size. So like if I change the birth size to say 0.1 and then change the death size to say something a little larger, let me flip this on its head. Let's set this at 0 and set this down a little bit so we can see what's happening. So you can see that the particles are being generated at that little spot and then released, and they start to grow over time. So the larger this percentage, the more of the time, the longevity time that it's holding the particles before they're released. So let's say your longevity time is set to 4 seconds, and then your hold particle release is set to 50%. It means it's going to hold the particles for 2 seconds, and then it's going to release them to live the rest of their life.
Is this what we'll be using for the aura effect?
Maybe. We're going to play with it. I don't know exactly what that's going to look like quite yet. We're going to just roll with it and see what happens.
Like have it like fade into white?
Right. So particle release, that's what it does. Composite with original. So if you check composite with original, it's going to composite the particles on whatever background you have selected or whatever layer you've put the particles on. So if you wanted your particle system directly put on a piece of video, which I don't necessarily recommend, if you wanted that video to show through correctly in the background, you could hit composite with original and it would composite it over the video layer that you put the particles on. Random seed. So random seed is kind of a cool one. So like let's say we're doing the whole layering up thing that I was talking about. Like you're trying to create a fire particle and you're creating multiple versions of that particle system, but you need some randomness built in there. So every time you change that number, it changes the output particle setup, right? So every time you change that number to anything different, it's going to create a new and different particle system. So like if I duplicate this particle system and then come in here and I change the random seed to 11, the particles are going to be different. And I'm going to not composite them on original anymore because I want them to be seen together. So you can see now we have 2 particle systems with the same parameters, but they have a different random seed, and you get 2 separate systems generated. So then if you came in here and you changed, I don't know, like the distance, you could start manipulating these particles to have a completely different look than the other ones that you had. You could change the motion type, you could change the birth and death sizes. And now we're starting to layer up different particle settings, different randomly generated particle systems to derive a better look for our particles. Okay, that's the whole thing, the whole particle system, all in what, an hour and a half, 2 hours? All right, so as you can tell, like this is a deep particle generating tool. There's a lot of parameters, a lot of things you can play with. It really helps to have an understanding of what everything does before you actually try to make it do something specific. So that's what we're going to get into next. So let's do it. So we want to make an aura come out from behind Dallas, right? So let's set that up and start making that work. So I'm going to delete my particle systems, and we're going to start from scratch. So go ahead and get settled in here, because we're going to go on a little adventure and find out how we can make particles emanate from Dallas. Make her look like she's in Dragon Ball Z. All right. So we have our Dallas image, and you're going to get a quick green screen tutorial here too while we're at it. So let's go ahead and drag that image onto our 1080p comp, and we should be seeing a huge version of Dallas on the screen. We need to scale that so that it fits properly within our composition. And let's frame it up so that it looks interesting. And let's see, so we've got, okay, so I'm going to scale this down just a little bit more. And I'm going to scoot her over to the right-hand side of the screen so that we don't have her arm cut off. And that is kind of what our frame is going to look like. Okay. Is everybody with me? We're going to get into green screen keying here real quick. We're going to get a grand tour of keying real fast. Yeah, go ahead.
Scale that again.
So I'm just using scale and position, so standard parameters. So S for scale, P for position. I'm just changing the parameters to make her fit in the screen where I want her to be.
Oh, okay.
All right, so here we go. I usually don't get into chroma key until several weeks in, but we're going to go ahead and key this because you guys came up with an interesting idea. So let's go over to effects and presets and type in key, K-E-Y, key. And what we're looking for is we're looking for Keylight 1.2. Keylight 1.2 is a pretty powerful chroma key system inside of After Effects. It's the plugin that we'll be using for all of our green screen work. And we want to drag and drop that onto Dallas's image. Yes.
I've reached a problem. I'm on the image, but I can't apply any effects onto it.
Do you have the composition selected? So make sure you're working in the composition and that you have the layer selected.
Okay.
Yeah, if you double click the layer for whatever reason and you're working in the layer over here, you're gonna have trouble like applying things and making things work right. So make sure you're in the composition. Did that help? I'll take a look for you real quick. What number are you at? 15? Come on. Do it. So, we're using Keylight. We grab the screen color. This is what we were looking at. The final result is what we were looking at. We grabbed the screen color, and then that keyed out the background. The next thing that we're doing is we're looking at the screen matte. There's a whole bunch of speckly crap up here in the corner that we want to get rid of, and there's also a bunch of speckly crap inside of Dallas's image that we would be able to see through if this was video. Like if it was video, this would play back as grain in the key, and it would look like shit. And that's not what we want. So we need to adjust our screen matte a little bit. So let's go down to the screen matte setting, and we're only going to adjust this just enough to get this to key the way that we want it to. If you overdo this, your key will look like garbage. So only adjust it just enough to get what you need, right? So we're going to clip the black, and what we're looking for when we clip the black is we just want to see this noise disappear, right? So the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this at full resolution so I can see what is actually happening in the full resolution image. So right here where it says half resolution, click that to full so we can get a good idea of what we're actually looking at. And then I'm going to go ahead and just clip the black, and I'm only going to clip it like 10%, and that seems to have done the job mostly on what we've got over there. I'm going to go up like 2% more and get rid of as much of that as I can. It looks like 17 is the magic number for clip black. And then we need to do the same thing on clip white, except we're going down this time. So I'm going to clip the white out until almost all that noise inside of Dallas's figure disappears. And it looks like it's done a pretty okay job. So that is pretty much what we're looking at for a decent key. So that got rid of all the noise inside the key, and we should be in a good place. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to change the replace method to none. And we're going to set our view back to final result. You guys all still with me? Okay, cool. If you have questions, please do not hesitate to ask. All right, so we should have Dallas pretty well keyed out. Now you can see if you click on the little alpha button here, toggle transparency grid, you can see that we've got a little bit of a gray line around the outside of Dallas's figure. And we're gonna go in and we're gonna fix that. So the way we fix that is we fix that with the shrink and grow option in the screen matte. So I'm gonna shrink this -1 pixels, and we're gonna start to see that little outside gray line disappear. And I'm basically just gonna minus this out until that gray line is almost gone. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm also going to soften this a little bit so that the the edge isn't too hard. So I'm setting the softness to like 0.8, and I'm setting the shrink grow to 2 pixels, and that should give us a pretty decent key. I could probably go a little higher with that shrink grow just to get rid of that gray line. And the other thing we can do is we can clip roll back too. That's looking pretty decent. Probably gonna set this to less. This is all really dependent too on what background you're actually putting behind her. And since we're putting particles behind her, we might be okay. We might even put some particles in front to make it look like this stuff is actually coming off of her, both behind and in front. Right. Okay, so we got an okay key so far. Let's continue moving forward. I'm gonna set the resolution back to half now that we have our key pulled. And we're gonna start creating some particles. So let's go ahead and make a new layer solid. So let's go new, solid, and we're gonna call this particle 1. And let's click OK. And I selected a blue color because we're gonna be making blue particles, and we may wanna make use of the original layer solid color. So we've got particle 1 selected. I'm also gonna change the name of my image, my Dallas image, to her name so that I know what the hell I'm looking at. Okay, and then we need to go ahead and put particle world on our layer solid. So let's type in particle and choose CC particle world and drag and drop that onto our layer solid. And now we have our stock particles. Okay, so before we move forward, somebody raise their hand and tell me what they think we're going to have to do to our particles to make them kind of do the Dragon Ball Z thing. Go ahead, Riley.
We'll have to move them more to the center of Dallas and then make the gravity go negative.
Okay, that's a very good start. What else can we do? Go ahead, DeAndre.
Well, yeah, still make it go in the center, but probably have the particles go around the entire body.
Okay, so we're going to need more than one particle system, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Connor. What do you
I was
think?
thinking maybe like have, I guess, a mask
Okay,
around Dallas's figure
okay.
for the particles to appear out of.
Okay, so one thing that we can do to get around that straight away is we can put our particles behind Dallas, right? So straight away, that's going to put Dallas in front of the particles. Now, this is going to be one of these things where it's like, I've not done this effect before, so I'm going to have to play with this to figure out exactly how I'm going to be able to get it to look like what I want it to look like. There's a few things that I can kind of figure that are going to happen straight away. Like, we're probably going to have to play with the producer and change the way that the producer works. Like, we might want a bigger producer. And we may need to create some smaller particle systems on their own as subcomps, derivative of the first one, that we can place in front of and around to like make the particles look like they're really wrapping and coming off of her figure, right? So there's going to be a bunch of different techniques that we're going to use here, but we have to kind of discover our way through it, and we're going to have to just work with the particle system until we get something that looks interesting. Go ahead, Riley.
You see that cube system blurring it out to make it more smoky?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly the kind of stuff that we're going to be doing. Go ahead, Connor.
Straight away, make gravity 0.
Okay, make gravity 0. Well, I think the gravity should go up. It should go negative, like Riley said. So let's start with some physics. Let's play around with some physics, and let's play around with some animation types. So I'm gonna go like
Negative the 0.24.
right. And I mean, there's some of the stuff that you can kind of play with, like vortex inverts the gravity, right? And then if we change the producer size, we instantly get this kind of like negative gravity crazy vortex thing going on. That might be a little too much. So I'm gonna stay with explosive right now. And let's change the producer's position a little bit so that it's kind of behind Dallas and maybe down a little lower. And then let's invert the gravity. So let's go negative 0.5 for the gravity, and that will make the particles fly up. So another thing that I think we can probably do here is we can add some resistance, right? Because we don't want the particles flying so crazy far that it looks funny, and we probably need to change the velocity a little bit and maybe the longevity a little bit so that the particles can last a little longer. And let's also change I'm going to drop the position down so that this particle system is kind of like starting basically right at where her like waist would be. and I'm going to increase the longevity so that the particles live all the way to the top of the screen. So right away we kind of got this type of a look. It probably needs to be faster, right? Like it needs to be faster, more fiery looking. Go ahead, Ethan.
How do I get the layer? How do I get the particle thing as its own layer?
You got to put it on a layer solid. So make a new layer solid and then drop your particles on that new layer solid.
I'm having trouble. I can't see the picture.
That's because you have your. Hold on. Did you?
Okay, you're clicked on the layer again. So if you double click a layer like this, if you double click it, it's going to open it up as its own layer. You want to make sure you're always in the composition window. Right? You can do stuff in those layers, like you can come in here and you can animate this stuff, but you got to make sure you're sticking in the composition window.
Right.
And then you'll be okay.
How do you get to slow down?
I use resistance and velocity. Holy buckets, Ethan. What are you doing? You're supposed to be working on Dallas, not some crazy whatever the hell that is. All right, so
Oh, I know what it is.
super shaggy. All right.
These foolish mortals think I have actually used 1% of my power. These foolish mortals think I've actually used
Okay.
Listen down.
No, they're actually adding him in tomorrow.
Well, you can use shaggy, but that key is garbage. And you're gonna want to throw in a background solid so you can actually see what you're doing.
They really think I used 1% of my power?
They think my power is 10% of my power.
All right, there you go. Now you're in good shape. All right. Super shaggy. Okay, so let's focus on our particles. So let's just go do some basic work to this. Let's change the particle type. I really like Riley's idea of going with the cubes. And then what we'll do is we'll change the birth and death size. So I think the birth size should be larger. So let's set that up to like 1. So it'll be a large birth size, and then let's set the death size down to like 0. So they'll continue to shrink over time. I think the other thing we need to do is we need to up that velocity some more. We need these to move faster, and we need to lower the resistance so that they really are flying. And then if anything, we change the longevity a little bit so that they're dying a little bit quicker. We need a little bit of resistance, so they're not flying out quite so far, but it's going to be one of these, like... Okay, so we're getting there. We just got to play around with this stuff a little bit. So I'm going to go back into the particle settings, and I'm going to change the burst size a little bit. I'm going to go down to 0.75. I'm going to change the producer size a little bit, too. Let's see, radius X. It's a little too big. There we go, and I'm gonna I'm gonna slow down the velocity, but I'm gonna increase the gravity. So I'm gonna go like half the velocity, but I'm gonna basically double the gravity so that they're getting pulled up quicker. Oh, -1. There we go, that's what I'm looking for.
Well, then you need to counter the resistance so that way it's more spread out as well.
We're getting there. We're getting there, little by little. Okay, so then let's play with the birth to death colors. So let's have our birth color be like kind of a nice blue color, and our death color be white. And if we really wanted to, we could set that to custom and we could create a custom map for it. But I think this will get us kind of where we need to go. Say that again? Oh, cool. All right. I can't remember whether or not motion blur works on these. Oh, it does. Okay, so let's turn on motion blur too, because that's going to help us out a lot straight away. So to turn motion blur on, click on the particle layer, and then make sure you're looking at the proper mode settings. So if you need to switch between track matte and your motion blur and 3D settings, just click that toggle switches modes button down at the bottom. And then you need to click this little box right here that will enable motion blur for that layer. And then you want to click enable motion blur for the composition. And then you should see your cubes in blurriness, which is exactly what we want. How we doing? We doing all right? Okay, so click on the layer. Then you got to enable motion blur on the layer itself, which is this little box right here. And then you need to enable motion blur in the composition, which is that little guy right there. All right, so now we have motion blur set. We've got kind of our particles doing some interesting stuff. Let's go ahead and let's add some additional blur to this. So let's go into the effects and presets and let's just use fast box blur. And then let's drop that on our particle system, and we're gonna give this a little bit of blurriness.
Do you drop it on Dallas?
Nope, not on Dallas. You're dropping it on the particle system.
Where? On your box. So right over here.
Yep, so you can either drop it inside the window, the effects window, or you can drop it right on the particle layer itself. And I'm gonna set this so that it's only doing the vertical blur. Oh no, that looks like garbage. Let's do horizontal and vertical, and I'm gonna also have it repeat the edge pixels. You're not getting motion blur, Connor?
I'm not getting any motion blur. I didn't want to have a lot.
You may not have a lot. It depends on the speed of your particles. If they're moving quickly,
Velocity down to 0.31.
yeah, if they're moving really slowly, you're not going to pick up any motion blur.
Okay.
Go ahead, Daniel.
How do you guys?
So motion blur is you enable it right here. So this on this little layer switch right here, that's where you enable it for the layer, and then you need to enable it here for the composition.
Oh, that was my problem.
Okay, so we have a nice kind of sort of particle system thing happening in the background that's looking okay. I'm gonna start playing a little bit with some of these particle types. Like, I don't know, I'm kind of feeling that whole like vortex thing.
If you look at mine, it's kind of good.
What did you do, Red?
I made it look like fire.
Fire. Okay, so this is only part one. So we're gonna start layering this up and changing some iterative things to make this look even more like fire. And then we're gonna go in and we're gonna add additional particle systems in front and behind to give it a better look overall. So let's continue with this, and let's actually just take this particle system and duplicate it. And then we're going to start playing with blending modes, because blending modes is really what's going to bring your particle systems to life. So we've got particle 1, particle 2. Let's go ahead and increase the blur radius on this to like double what it is right now. So I'm going to set the blur radius to 14. I'm going to go even higher than that. I'm going to go like 30. So we get some really nice soft blurriness going on with the particles. And then what we're going to do is we're going to toggle the switches and modes, and we're going to go into this blending mode tab right here, and we're going to change the blending mode to screen. And it's going to start giving our particles a little bit more fiery life.
Wait, can you do that again?
Yep, so you're going into the blending mode section right here, and I set the blending mode to add. I tried screen, but that wasn't really jiving with me. So I set it to add. You guys with me?
No.
Okay, so blending mode, I duplicated the particle system, and I changed the blending mode to add, and it's going to start making our particles look a little more fiery looking.
I don't have a little menu there. Click
Okay, so click the toggle switches modes button down at the bottom, and that will give you the modes and track mats. And then you can change the blending mode. So this little button down here at the bottom, this is what you're looking for. Toggle switches modes will change the modes and switches. So we're changing the blending mode right now.
What blur did you add?
I just used the same fast box blur, but I increased the radius of it to 30.
Fast blur.
Did you get there, Peter?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so this is kind of looking pretty good, but let's add some additional effects. So one of the things that you can do to make your effects or your particles look even better is we can add effects on top of the particle layers themselves to give them a more fiery or turbulent look. So let's go into effect, or let's go to layer, new, adjustment layer. And we're gonna create an adjustment layer just for our particles. And I'm changing the name of the particle to particle adjustment. And you're gonna have to bear with me a little bit on this. I'm gonna try something like a displacement. It's like turbulent displace. And I'm gonna put that on my particle effect. And if I stop this, you can see that it's drastically changed the shape of my particles, right? So this is a great way to make your particles take on a more fiery look without having to actually go change any of the parameters inside of your particles themselves. Turbulent displace is pretty awesome like that. So you can increase the complexity, you can change the evolution. It'll start making it even look like fire when you just rotate the evolution around. You can change the size of the turbulent displace. You can make it really small or really big. You can change the amount. And now when we play this back, we start getting some pretty crazy looking effects. If we say animate the evolution over time, so I'm going to click on the evolution keyframe, and I'm going to just move this forward 4 seconds, and I'm going to have it do a couple rotations. So I change the evolution, and now we've got this very fiery looking effect going on in the background. Turbulent displace. You guys digging this?
It actually looks like it's close to alternate.
It's starting to look like fire, right? So you have to play with this stuff to kind of get it to do what you want it to do. And sometimes one of the things that we're going to need to do is we're just going to need to play a lot and like duplicate some layers and play with offset. Like, where is this actually generating the fire look from? There we go. That's looking pretty good. Evolution options. Let's do cycle evolution. Ooh, yeah, there we go. That's looking pretty cool. Okay, so this is just one layer, right? So let's take this layer, and what we're going to do is we're going to pre-compose these. So let's grab particle adjustment and the first two particle layers, and let's right-click on those layers. So I'm holding Shift to select all those layers, you guys. Let's right-click on those layers and say pre-compose, and we're going to call this BG Fire 1. And we're going to say move all attributes in a new composition and adjust the duration of the time span for the selected layers. And then we're going to say open composition. We don't need to have it open the composition. I just want to put these all in one layer. So there we go. We got background fire. Boom.
I think I did something wrong.
Oh, it looks so. Whoa.
Me too.
Okay, do you need to see that again? So we've got 2 layers of particles in our BG fire particle layers, right? Right here. Background fire layer. We've got turbulent displace on there. And we can play around with all this stuff to kind of make it look more interesting, which is good. Interesting is good. And now we're going to start layering this stuff up a little bit more. So now what I want you to do is go back to the project window. So you probably have the effects controls selected. Let's select a project window, and let's duplicate our BG Fire 1. And now it'll give us a second copy of the background fire composition. And we're going to go into that composition, and we're going to make changes, and we're going to start layering up the fire in the background so that it looks more interesting. You guys ready? Okay, so here we go. So I've got BG Fire 2. Let's go ahead and add that into the main composition that we're working on with Dallas, and we'll put it in above our fire layer. right? So right now it matches, but we're going to go in and we're going to change some parameters in there so that it doesn't match, so that we get a different looking type of particle system for that second background fire layer. So let's go ahead and double click the background fire layer 2, and it will open that composition, and we can go in and we can start playing around with these parameters. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to start playing with, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into that extras setting, and I'm going to change that random seed number so it gives me a different looking particle type. So extras, random seed. Yeah, go ahead, Peter.
We're not getting any effects controls.
Oh yeah.
For the second one.
So if you need to, just go into the effects preset and double click particle world, and it should pull it up. So like go into the actual layer itself, go into effects and double click particle world, and it'll open it up. So I'm going to do the same thing on both particle systems. So we have 2 particle systems. I mean, this could actually look kind of cool if I let that kind of be a little vaporous in the background. That is actually kind of cool looking. I'm going to go into the second particle system, the one on the bottom, and we're going to make some changes here too. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to change the birth to death size. So I get some like smaller shards of fire in the second layer. Right? So that gives me a totally different look. And I'm also going to change that seed number too on this one. So I'm going to go into the extras and I'm going to change this random seed. I'm going to change this one to 13. And it's going to give me some different looks. And let's go back and see what it did to our fire. It's starting to look more complex and interesting, which is good. It's what we want. Let's go back and play with this a little bit more. I actually really like this kind of like vaporous fire in the background. I'm gonna change a few things here too. This is, I mean, we're at the point now where like you have a particle system set up, it's doing kind of what you want it to do. Now we're adding complexity and interest to this stuff to make it look more like fire, to make it look more fiery. We can also do things like change blending modes. Like we can come in here and play with blending modes and try to get blending modes to help this out as well. We can change colors. There's all kinds of stuff we can do here. Like if we wanted to say add like a hue saturation to this color, to this second fire layer, and change its lightness, or colorize it, or change what color it is to give it some more visual interest. Like we could make it more of a turquoise color if we wanted to. We could oversaturate it. Like there's tons of different things we can do to make this more interesting. I'm gonna go into this fire layer and I'm gonna actually decrease the opacity of this just a little bit so that we get a little bit less craziness going on in the background. So I'm going to go back to Fire 2 and I'm going to increase my birth rate on some of this stuff so I get a little bit more of the vapory cube look in the background. On the smaller particles in the foreground, I'm going to increase the birth rate a little bit so I get some more some interest there. I'm changing blending modes here a little bit just to play around with the way things are looking. We can change colors too. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff we can just do with color to kind of make this stuff look more interesting. I'm going to change the color on this as well so that we get kind of an interesting looking. Add some color to it with turquoise. I'll go back to the main comp and play this back and see what it's looking like. All right, it's looking better and better by the second. We can do other stuff, like we could come into this second layer and say we can scale it a little bit so that it looks a little bit different in terms of how it's set up the other layers. So this is what I was referring to as layering it up, right? So we're using, now we have 4 layers of particles, 2 different adjustment layers. We can control all these things and change the complexity of our fire and really start making this stuff look very interesting. Let's go back into BG Fire 2 and I'm just going to play with these particle systems a little bit more. I'm going to play with my producers a little bit. I didn't want to change the Z position. I wanted to actually stretch this out a little bit. There we go. Maybe add a little bit of resistance to this in terms of physics. Starts to make it look kind of cool. Pulling the radius just a little bit more. Might play with the turbulent displace on this a little bit as well. changing the complexity and just kind of where the turbulent displace is generated, playing with the amounts.
You're all laughing, but it's not fun.
It's awesome. Look at how cool you look, Dallas. If we only had like the Dragon Ball Z look on her face, we could go in and jib jab her mouth and make her mouth all crazy too. Okay, all right. So we have a decent looking fire thing going on in the background. I might come in here and change some of these. These still are looking a little bit cubey to me. So I'm gonna come in here. I'm gonna play with the particle type a little bit. I might go tetrahedron, which will make them look a little bit more triangle-y rather than cubey. Let's try the tetrahedron. Ooh, that's better. Oh, there we go. Yeah, okay, cool. Starting to get there. Some things are happening. Well, we're going to add more. We're going to put some fire in front. We're going to color correct Dallas so that she actually takes on some of the lighting. We're going to do all kinds of stuff to this. All right, so we have some decent fire going on here. It's not too bad. Let's...
Excuse me, how did you make a second BG Fire? Because like...
So project... BG Fire 1, and then I just duplicated this composition here. So you can't duplicate the one that you have down in the layer stack down here in the timeline, because that doesn't actually create a new composition. It just creates a duplicate of that layer.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense.
Okay, so let's see some stuff that I can do to make this look interesting. I'm going to add a background in on this. Let's go BG ramp. And this is going to be black for now. So I'm adding a background color to this so that it's got something to work with. I'm going to make a ramp in the background. So I'm using the ramp effect on my background layer. And I'm going to change the color of this ramp. So I'm going to make this a radial ramp. We're going to have the start color be behind Dallas down here. And the end color is going to be way out here. And I'm going to change the colors themselves to something that's a little more akin to what we're doing with this particular composition. Cool. All right. Okay, awesome. So things are starting to look fiery and interesting. All right, so let's do a little bit more work on Dallas herself. So I'm going to come into Dallas's layer, and we're going to do a little bit of color correction on her. So, yeah, go ahead.
How did you make the background different again?
So I added a new layer solid, and I just added a gradient ramp to that to give it to put a gradient in the background so that we have something in the background that the different blending modes are working on, things like that. So the gradient itself just looks like this. It's just a circular ramp with two different colors in it. If we wanted to, we could go, grab some crazy background that we could, do some stuff with. All right, so I'm going to do a little bit of color correction on Dallas to make her look a little bit more like she's being affected by these fiery colors around her. So I'm going to go into Dallas, and let's see. I think what I'm going to do is, well, first we'll just color correct her. So I like to use curves to color correct. So I'm typing in curves over in effects and presets, and I'm going to take curves and I'm going to put it on Dallas's layer, and I'm going to do what's called just a contrast curve first. And that looks like this. We take the curve and we create kind of an S with it. So it gives her a nice contrasty look. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate Dallas's layer, and I'm going to add a hue saturation. So hue saturation on Dallas 2, and we're going to colorize her. And we're going to make her kind of similar in terms of color to the background. There we go. And then I'm just gonna I'm gonna take some of the opacity out of this so we get some of the original color coming through, and she kind of takes on this bluish look. There we go.
How'd you do that again?
So I duplicated Dallas's layer, and then I used a curves adjustment. Well, first I used a curves adjustment on the original Dallas layer. So if I solo Dallas, I added curves, and it basically just gave her some contrast. Right? So add curves, and then I created a little S curve. And then I duplicated Dallas's layer, and I added a hue saturation to it, and did colorize and change the color of her a little bit. This is all stuff you guys can play around with to just embellish the look of this. And we're gonna have like a whole class on color grading. So if you miss this stuff, it's not the end of the world. The big thing here is to just work on manipulating your particles and making them do what you want them to do. So we have some kind of fiery looking thing going on behind Dallas, which is cool. I want to start adding some of that foreground fire that I was talking about. Some foreground particle layers that have an interesting look to them that we can use to kind of layer up the fire in the foreground. Go ahead, Riley.
Try and get the color to be blue like you have it.
Uh-huh.
Can't figure it out.
On Dallas?
Yeah.
Okay. So that is it's a combination of things. I used the curves adjustment, and then I used hue saturation, colorized it, and then just adjusted the hue and the saturation to kind of give her a specific color.
Wait, how'd you colorize it?
Just click the colorize button on hue saturation. So if you look at that layer by itself, full transparency, that's what it looks like. I also decreased the transparency so that you can see a little bit of the normal Dallas through the colorization.
I'm having trouble colorizing because it turns red when I colorize.
Oh.
I'm not sure
Yep,
why.
and then you got to go and you got to play with the hue and the saturation and the lightness.
Okay. Thank you.
You are welcome. All right, should we move on and do some additional firework here? Okay, so we got Dallas, we got some fire background stuff going on. Now let's add some elements that we can use in the foreground. So for this, we're gonna kind of take a different approach to this. I'm gonna create a new composition, and I'm gonna call this FG Fire Effects. And I'm gonna make this composition much larger than our original 1920 by 1080 composition. I'm just gonna do a 4K composition. So that makes this composition 4096 by 3112. And I'm actually going to change the height and width. I'm going to make this taller than it is wide because the fire is going to go up, and I want to kind of be able to make, like, angle it and change the way that it moves and change the gravity of it and things like that. So I'm going to change how all this stuff works. So Fire Effects 4K film is what I'm using. It's a really large composition, and I'm going to change these two numbers, 3112, 4096, so that it's taller than it is wide. And I'm going to say fit up to 100%. So we've got this great big 4K composition, and now what we're going to do is we're going to create a new layer solid, and we're going to start working some additional particle effects here. And I'm going to create a blue color for this.
I'm sorry, I completely missed that last part.
Okay, so I'm just creating, what I'm doing is I'm creating additional particle effects to go on top of Dallas, right? So I made a larger composition, 4096 by 3112, and I made it taller than it is wide, right? So we're using a new composition, and we're gonna add some more particle effects to her. So, and now this is just basically what we were doing before. So I'm gonna come in here with particles. I'm actually, what I should do is just come in here to Fire BG2. What was that?
Was it a layer solid?
Well, it's a new composition and then a layer solid. Yep.
What was the width again?
It was 4096 by 3112.
And what's the resolution?
4096 by 3112.
That is the wrong direction.
Okay, so let's just kind of like hang in there with me as much as you can. We're gonna make this work. Let's see. Okay. Let's shut that off for a minute. All right, this is just going to be easier to start from scratch. Okay, so you guys have a new composition, right? Now the composition size is arbitrary. This might be way too big for what I need, but what I'm basically trying to do here is I'm going to create some particle effects that we can like put in place and like move and rotate them around and change their turbulent displacement to kind of give her some foreground fire effects. That's what we're working for here. And the reason I'm making the composition so large is so that the particles are smaller and we have some flexibility in terms of where we can place and rotate them inside of the composition. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. All right, so we got fire effects 2. We're making a new layer solid. So this is basically what we did before. I'm picking a similar blue color, and we're going to call this particles. So we're just creating additional particles here. And we're going to put particle world on there, and we kind of start from scratch. So there's a few things that I know I want to do right away. I want to go in, I want to change the particle type. I'm going to go with like tri-poly on this one. I want to change the color of the birth to death colors. I want them to kind of match what we had before. So blue to like a light blue. I'm going to invert the gravity like we did before in the other one. So I'm going to change the gravity from from 0.5 to -1. That makes the particles go up. And I'm also going to kind of increase the resistance. So one thing that I want to achieve inside this composition is I don't want any of the particles to leave the border of the composition. I want them to be all contained within the composition itself, which is why I made the composition so large. And then I'm just going to move the producer around a little bit so that the particles are being generated kind of from the bottom part of the composition. So I'm changing the producer and moving the producer down to the bottom, and this is kind of what we get. Cool. Okay, so I can increase the longevity a little. Oops, that was the birth rate. Longevity is going to increase. I kind of want these to go up and not die too quickly. We're going to do some more playing around with the birth and death size. So birth size, I'm going to make it a little larger. Death size, I'm going to make small. Basically 0. And it looks like the birth size is way too big. Let's go 0.25. Maybe a little larger than that, 0.35. This stuff at this point is pretty much subjective, you guys. So I'm going to do some other things that we've already done. I'm going to turn on motion blur for this layer so that we get some motion blur on our particles. I'm going to increase the velocity a little bit. It's looking kind of cool. I want this to kind of... No. Fire could work. Alright, that's kind of cool. And then this stuff is really all arbitrary stuff. I'm gonna play with my producer size a little bit so I can get something a little wider I can play with.
How do I affect the speed of which they're moving?
Velocity.
I've tried that, it's not working.
It should work. Well, the velocity is the speed in which they leave the producer, right? So the velocity in which they're actually moving up is the gravity. So if you want them to move faster, increase the gravity. Like if I double the gravity, particles go twice as fast. I just want to make sure that they don't leave the composition. Okay, and now I'm going to start doing some similar things that I did before. Like I'm going to add that fast box blur back in. I might add a couple of blurs to this one just to really make it look soft and fiery. And we're going to do turbulent displace again as well. There we go. It's looking pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and add that adjustment layer and turbulent displace again. And I'm going to change the offset so that it's down near the base, and I'm going to increase the size and amount until it's looking super crazy. All right, now we're eating up some CPU cycles. Awesome. All right, so then I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this, blur it out even further. Let's go like 30 pixels again, and I'm going to change the seed number so that we get a different look. And I'm also going to do the blending mode thing again so that we get some kind of fiery looking stuff going on. Okay, so now what we can do with this is we can bring it in and we can layer it up over the top of Dallas in the front. So I'm going to take Fire Effects to the main composition, and I'm going to drop this on top. And you can see straight away now we've got foreground fire happening, and we can scale this and move it and kind of place it where we want it to be. So like if I wanted this to say come off of Dallas's shoulder, I could maybe move this up to the left. Could change the blending mode of it so that it overlays. There we go. That's looking pretty good. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to mask this a little bit. So I'm going to mask this off so that it kind of looks like it's emanating from her shoulder. And I'm going to invert that mask so that I can actually see what I want to see. And I'm going to feather it a little bit. So now when we play this forward, we kind of got this new layer of fire that's coming off of her shoulder on the left-hand side and floating up. If we wanted to continue, like we could also mask around her face a little bit so that it doesn't doesn't kind of overwhelm her face. Let's change. So when you have multiple masks on a layer, you're gonna have to play with the way that they work with each other. So you do that with the modes. So I can say subtract, and that will subtract the particles from her face. And I can feather that out a little bit too. Let's play this back and see what it's looking like. So now you can see what I'm talking about in terms of processor cycles too. Like it takes a longer time to render this stuff. Starting to get there. Starting to look kind of cool. Let's go back and look at our reference and see what else we can do to this.
If you want to search about a GIF
for
of
fuck's
it, you can
sake.
see how it moves.
That'd be cool. All right, so there's some stuff in the foreground. So she's got this like tight aura around her. Let's create that tight aura around Dallas, and we can actually use.
That's a dude.
What was that?
Goku's a male, even though the Japanese voice actor is a female.
Oh, I was talking about Dallas. Go ahead, Riley.
I have a time issue. Like, when I press space.
Okay, try not to interrupt people, DeAndre. Go ahead, Riley.
I can't play what I have because something's up with the time thing. There's something that shouldn't be there.
Here, let me see. 16. Give me 1 second. I'll pull up your machine and take a peek. Come on now. Hurry up.
Oh, I figured it out.
Did you get it?
Yeah. But how do I move the animation that I made in the Fire Effects over to the main comp?
Okay, so it's okay. You got that. So all you do is you go over to Project, take your Fire Effects, and you're dropping them on the main comp. Right? And they're pretty big right now. You can see that they are indeed there, but you need to scale them down a little bit. Right? That's why we made them 4K. So we could scale them up, scale them down. We could rotate them, twist them, move them, basically place them wherever we want to place them. Okay, I'll give you back control here. All right, so moving forward. So creating Dallas's aura. So this is, hang in there for this one. This isn't something that you have to do on yours, but this is going to be a little bit interesting the way that we make this happen. So the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to take one of the layers of Dallas and I'm going to duplicate it. I'm going to put it behind her, right? And then we're going to go into the effects and presets, and instead of final result, we're going to set this to screen matte, right? And you'll see right away we've got this black and white version of Dallas. So what I want to do here is I want just the white, right? Because I want to be able to use this as an aura, and then I want to like scale it a little bit so that it looks like it's right next to her. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a track mat. And I talked about this before in one of our previous classes where you can use black and white to kind of create mats of things. And so we're going to call this Dallas Aura. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this aura and we're going to duplicate it. And then we're going to use a track mat so that we only have the white of Dallas, right? So those two layers work together. So we're not actually seeing the second layer. That second layer is creating the key for Dallas's aura. And then what we're going to do is we're going to select fill, and we're going to fill her aura with solid white. Boom. All right, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pre-compose these like I did with the particles. So I'm going to select those two layers, pre-compose, and I'm going to call this Dallas Aura. And now if we unsolo that, you can see that if we increase the scale a little bit, we've got a nice little white aura around Dallas. Now, is it perfect? No, but it's pretty damn close. And if you needed to, we could change the scales a little bit to kind of create a better aura around her. There's another trick that you could use. It's called Minimax. This one's kind of funky. So let's put this back on black so you can see what's happening here. So Minimax is a channel effect. So it works on black and white layers, and you can actually increase the radius. Let's see. Color, horizontal, vertical. I don't know if that's actually going to work in this instance. Let's see. I might need to do this on the layer itself. Come over here and let's see if this works. Ah, phooey. Oh, I know what we could do. Okay. We could go like this. So if we want to make Dallas's aura a little bit better and like really work the way that it's supposed to, I'm going to go back over to aura. I'm going to turn off the soloing. Okay, that's correct. I'm going to actually use the shrink grow method inside of the mat. So if I go screen mat and then we shrunk it. So if I grow this, it's going to grow the edges around Dallas to the point where we'll be able to see that behind her. That's looking pretty good. It's got a little bit of an edge on it over here, and that's because that's where the edge of the photo stops. There's not much we can do about that, but let's do this. Let's add a turbulent displace to this. And now we can actually start to animate it and make it look fiery and stuff. Ooh, there we go.
This looks like we're making a comic book cover.
Yeah, I'm gonna animate the evolution over time. So let's see. I'm going fast here. I just want to kind of like get some more of this in before we call it a night. So I'm just animating the turbulent displace over time. I mean, then once you have that aura, you could actually do some of the same stuff that we were doing before. Like we could go back in here, we could duplicate her aura, and we could call this one like aura blue, not clue, blue. Yep. Go in here. We could go into the mat again and increase the shrink grow even further. I wish there was a way to get around the edge, but we don't really have that option, unfortunately. But that's okay. Go back here, pull in that same aura blue, drop it in behind. Let's grab that same turbulent displace that we used on the previous layer and paste it over on the blue layer, and then we can come in and we can use hue and saturation to colorize it. So hue, saturation, colorize. We're going to decrease the lightness a little bit, which will give us our color. And then we can find the hue that we like and the saturation that we like. Let's see, what else can we do here? Turbulent displace. We could do crazy stuff like take this and scale it along one axis so that it's stretched out a little bit. Maybe change the amount of the turbulent displace, increase it, increase the size a little bit. We could play with blending modes on this stuff too. Same with the aura. We can maybe pull back the transparency a little bit. And all that stuff needs to be animated as well over time. So let's see. Aura blue, evolution. Needs to be animated. There we go. Now it's all moving. If we did things like duplicated the other fire effect on this side, we could move that over to the other side. Or we could just flip it using scale. So scale, and I think it's this one, -31. Nope. -31. There it is. I just flipped it so that I can move it over to the other side and put it on our other shoulder. And you play this back and you kind of get a crazy looking wild effect. So as you can see, you can do a lot with particles. So you obviously don't need to take it this far, but manipulate your particles and make something interesting. Don't forget to storyboard. Do the best you can. If you have questions, refer to the lecture and or ask your friends and peers to help you out. And or Google. There are lots of Video Copilot things you can look at as well. The other thing that you would do in instances like this that can be really handy is to actually use real assets. So like real fire, real particle effects that have been shot with a camera that you can composite into shots like this to really make them look authentic and organic. Nice. I know we went really late tonight. I really appreciate you guys hanging in there. I'll get this lecture uploaded and link it on D2L, and you guys are good to go for the night. You're welcome.
So for the homework, we're just like making the same.
You're doing your own thing for the homework. So you're taking what we learned about particles tonight, you're manipulating your particles to perform a specific function. So that could be like fire coming out of a dragon's mouth. It could be a tornado tearing apart. Smoke coming out of your ears. There's a million different things you can do with it. So just find something that you're interested in. Make sure that you're utilizing non-copyrighted material. Shoot your own images, photos, draw something if you want to, etc., etc. All the good stuff.